my agreeableness has also gotten me into trouble. And when you look at my personality, because you can top me off with a little bit of a neuroticism chaser, well, that's all my self-doubt and self-devaluation, which when it's coupled with my empathy, that agreeableness, it was like blood on the water for the narcissistic shark. Today we're going to talk about your personality, and we're going to talk about how it affects and is affected by your narcissistic relationship. Again, we've always been talking about their narcissistic personality. Let's talk about yours. In this new series, we're going to take on the big 5 personality traits. And for those of you who don't know what they are, they're neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, openness, and conscientiousness. And we're going to lay out how these personality styles, which all of us have some of these and not all, may put you at risk for a narcissistic relationship, how your personality style may affect your experience in a narcissistic relationship, and how your particular personality styles may affect your healing process. Now, there are internet versions of the tests that give you these results. Some of them have been called the Ocean test online. Some are called the Big 5. These are rough versions. They're not the real thing. The real thing is called the NEO-PIR. You can only get that through a licensed psychologist. But there are ways to get this online if you choose. You don't have to, though. This particular personality test measures normal personality and not the more maladaptive personality styles like narcissism. Think of these as a spectrum, right? For any of these, if you have a low score, you're low in that particular personality trait. You're high score, you're high in it. And in the middle, which is where most of us are on many of these, it kind of like tells us, kind of gives you a moderate level, sort of normal level of that functioning. And we're going to break this down as we talk about these traits. Every one of us, though, has one of these that is sort of our highest of the 5. And when we look at how this all hangs together, our highest, our second highest, and how high they are, we can get sort of a personality snapshot for a person. So these personality styles in you really can have so much to do with your experience in narcissistic relationships. And 2 different people with 2 different kind of personality styles will have different experiences in a narcissistic relationship to some degree. Let's start with neuroticism. Now, when we hear the term neuroticism, we often think of someone who's neurotic, right? And that sort of feels like uptight and kind of like fussy. That's just sort of a armchair, not real version of it. That's not what neuroticism means. Neuroticism can be thought of as what we call negative emotionality, negative emotions. And people who have higher neuroticism scores experience more negative emotions like anxiety, depression, worry, sadness. Now, if a person gets really high levels of neuroticism, it's more indicative of emotional instability and sensitivity. Everything is felt really deeply and uncomfortably. People who have much higher levels of neuroticism they don't do well under conditions of stress. If, again, those high scorers, they tend to be more emotionally dysregulated, much more on edge. People with really high neuroticism scores may have a sense of hopelessness and helplessness and are more likely to be clinically depressed and experience anxiety, have trouble coping with their emotions. That's the really high end of neuroticism. When we get to sort of the moderate high levels, we tend to see someone who's more prone to worrying, rumination, struggles a bit more when they're experiencing stress, a little bit more pessimistic. In people who have neuroticism scores in the normal to lower end, we see a person who's more emotionally stable and resilient. Now, neuroticism can be manifested in things like mood swings, hostility, worry, indecisiveness, sadness, and fear, right? So I think you're kind of getting a fuller picture of it. Okay, so you can probably guess the answer. How does this kind of neuroticism style place a person at risk for narcissistic relationships? Because this is an anxious style, characterized by a person having more negative emotions, there's going to be a greater likelihood of second guessing, self-doubt, ruminating. Interestingly, many of the patterns we see in a person who may be experiencing narcissistic abuse. However, these patterns, having a neurotic style and then being in one of these relationships in the early phase, A person higher in neuroticism is more likely to justify and second guess and blame themselves for what's happening in the relationship. That can be a setup for a fast forward on the trauma bonded experience. During the narcissistic relationship, this neuroticism personality style is absolutely treacherous because so much of the fallout of narcissistic abuse parallels the patterns that a moderate to high neuroticism person is already prone to. So the self-doubt and the helplessness and the worry and the self-blame are all going to be multiplied and may result in more severe fallout from going through narcissistic abuse. At the end of a relationship, people who have higher neuroticism scores may really struggle with the anxieties and vulnerabilities brought up by abandonment, loss, and grief. And this may make the end of a relationship particularly painful and also magnify trauma-bonded cycles of breakup, makeup, starting a relationship, stopping a relationship, black and white, hot and cold. The avoidance of abandonment may be so profound that these cycles may persist, the on and off, to a point where they really can harm someone. Now, during the healing phase from narcissistic abuse, higher neuroticism folks may actually have some of the greatest difficulties of all of these personality styles. The rumination may keep a person stuck. The tendency to already sort of tilt into negative moods as a rule can mean a person with moderate to high neuroticism may actually become clinically depressed, anxious, and all of this, as you could imagine, can complicate healing. Remember, personality is a style, right? It's not an illness. So this means that the way a person with a higher neuroticism score interprets what's happening in the relationship, it's often going to be very negative, typically self-blaming. And during the healing phase, for people who have high neuroticism scores, it's easy to get stalled and stuck for a long time. These are the people I witness who do struggle for many years to heal, and throughout the healing process may keep getting pulled into darker moods, greater worries, and more trouble coping. Well, just as a sort of little sidebar, you might wonder, what if a person had no neuroticism whatsoever? Well, that's something we'd actually see in psychopathy. No anxiety, no sadness, no emotion. Psychopathic people are actually pretty good at coping with stress because nothing causes any autonomic activation for them. They don't cope with it well and not in a way that's good. And we're not talking about that here. So just that's a curiosity question for you. So that's your neuroticism intro. And all of us have some of this. We're mostly at the middle normal level. We may have a little worry, a touch of pessimism, but when it really creeps up and those scores get higher, it can be difficult in terms of creating risks of getting and staying in narcissistic relationships, the amount of harm they can do to people who are higher in these styles, and healing. In fact, I would venture to say that the moderately high to high neuroticism group may suffer the most from narcissistic abuse compared to all of the big 5 traits and have the greatest difficulty recovering. So, what should a higher neuroticism person do to sort of enhance their coping and healing? Be in therapy. Be in therapy with a therapist who understands trauma and narcissistic abuse. Having this kind of personality style really does require more focused intervention, and the risk of depression and anxiety and traumatic fallout are greater for people with much higher neuroticism scores, and support is needed to navigate these waters. You can't work this out by yourself with just a book or a class. We're going to talk about extroversion. So let's just start in the middle, that moderate, maybe moderate high level of extroversion. Let me tell you, you extroverts have it all made in the shade. Things look good. Extroversion is characterized by higher energy. People who have that solid level of extroversion are sociable, warm, assertive. They're active in the world. They're excitement seeking, and they tend to have more positive emotions. These can be upbeat people who have large social circles. They like attention. They're the ones who talk in class. They talk in meetings. They talk in social groups. They're up for anything. They tend to have lots of friends and acquaintances. That's that healthy range, moderate, even to the moderate high range. That's what extroversion looks like. Now, at the lower end, very low end of extroversion, and this is where things get a little bit tricky in my estimation, is introversion. Introverted people tend to be more quiet, less energetic, not so attention-seeking. They take a minute before they speak. They definitely do not seek out large social gatherings as a baseline. They'll still go. It's just not their strength. Introverts aren't shy. They're not socially anxious. They just don't thrive off of social stimulation, which is in contrast to the extroverted folks who almost need the social stimulation. This can give introverts a bad reputation as standoffish, aloof, too much in their heads, and as boring. And I'm going to own it. I'm a little defensive when it comes to introversion because I'm introverted. Much as I sit here and yammer at you on YouTube, I'm very introverted. I'll go to a party, I'll have fun at a party, but I don't need the party. I'll come home probably on the earlier side and be very tired. TV at home is usually more than enough for me. It's often enough for many introverts. I have a team member on my team she's an introvert, and she actually has a really interesting life. She goes to lectures, she goes to concerts, she goes to classes, but she sticks to her smaller social group. So that's, again, very in the world, but introverted. So let's stick to extroversion now. So what about those very high levels of extroversion? They can't be alone. They have to have people around to a fault. They're attention seeking. They have to be the center of attention. They need to be the one who is heard. I think you see where this is going. Narcissism researcher Delroy Paulus calls narcissistic people disagreeable extroverts. And we know narcissism is in fact correlated with higher levels of extroversion. But nothing is ever simple in the personality space. And our vulnerable, covert narcissistic folks, they tend to be more introverted. Here's the thing, introversion is such a big topic, maybe it's selfish, that I'm going to give it its own video. So we'll break down the introversion because it does have impacts on the introverts and narcissistic relationship. So you may be wondering, can extroversion actually put you at risk for getting into a narcissistic relationship? Hell yeah. The extroverts may be more drawn to a person who is already at the center of the crowd, who may be, the extroverts may be more often likely to be in crowds where the narcissistic folks are. They may actually really enjoy the wild ride that the grandiosity takes you on. Extroverts may be down with all the excitement and all the positive emotionality. Means that you would be willing as an extrovert to see their narcissistic behavior in a kinder way and maybe even make more excuses for it. And let me tell you, narcissistic people love other extroverts. They love the upbeat social energy, the up for anything vibe, the positivity. So you're at a moderate high level of extroversion. You're probably more likely to meet folks with narcissistic personalities and for them to really like you. So now let's say you're an extrovert, you get into a narcissistic relationship. How is this going to affect you? Here is where it gets really interesting. You may actually be quite upbeat, even as the unhealthy stuff is happening in the relationship. You may also still have a strong support network that allows you to remain relatively resilient in the face of the narcissistic behavior. But if we are talking about more severe narcissistic abuse that is protracted for a long time, you may find that your extroversion slowly gets silenced and turned off. There just simply isn't enough room for both of you to get attention. Many narcissistic people are jealous, so they may not even be okay with you speaking out or people noticing you. So you, to stay in the relationship, may very subtly start turning yourself off. This can make the narcissistic abuse feel worse because you may feel cut off from the world, which you really enjoy. You might be cut off from the energy of other people and realize that you're giving up that part of yourself that likes to be in the world just to keep the relationship going. If you were more extroverted, naturally extroverted as a child, and you had narcissistic parents, you may find that having a narcissistic parent silenced this inherent part of you and your personality. And while you may have enjoyed large groups and friends and that energy, you may find that your wings were clipped in childhood. Narcissistic people, whether they are parents, friends, partners, colleagues, they do not like to share the stage. So what if you also have a very, very high level of extroversion? Now, remember, high extroversion, we may see more antagonistic stuff like narcissism, people who need attention, people who really cannot be alone. If that's you, it could also mean that in a narcissistic relationship, arguments get volatile, with both of you competing for attention. And you may also find it harder to leave because you don't want to be alone. But again, this is at very high levels of extroversion, which is probably not most people watching this channel. And what about as you get out of a narcissistic relationship? I actually think that the healthy, those moderate, low, high extroverts who come out of a narcissistic relationship may be very well positioned to heal. As you slowly give permission back to your natural personality, you may be more likely and drawn to seek out other people, to be in groups, and to get socially active. However, no matter who it happens to, narcissistic abuse is not easy to recover from, and the fallout is painful. So this is not to say that extroverted people don't suffer. They absolutely do. But extroverts may have some inherent temperamental stuff that makes some of the things that you need to do to heal come more naturally. Extroverts get into relationships with narcissistic people all the time, and it can be a really devastating moment when it does come crashing down because because you have such positivity because of your extroversion. It kind of challenges your sort of the worldview that extroverts have of the world. But I'm going to be brutally honest. This is a Dr. RAMANI moment here. Just like I envy people who can dance, play the guitar, and who cook really well, I really also envy extroverts. When I watch an extrovert go through a room and not get depleted and just be able to be on, I'm like, I wish I could do that. It's a really good skill to have. The Western world is very extrovert friendly. My graduate student, Irene, found that extroverts look better on a lot of mental health outcomes and just functioning overall. But I'm always going to be the standard bearer for all the virtues of introversion. However, I do believe that healthy extroverts, while they are vulnerable to getting drawn into narcissistic relationships, after the initial and difficult part of healing passes, have some great tools that will help them work through the healing process. So you extroverts out there kind of have some extroversion envy over here, but doesn't protect you. If anything, it makes you more vulnerable on the front end. So be on your game, have that positivity, but above all, what extroverts need is discernment. We have talked about neuroticism and extroversion so far. So now I'll take a little bit of a sort of a side road here and talk about introversion. Traditionally, introversion has been treated as just the opposite or the counterweight to extroversion. It's not. Introversion is just not merely the opposite of extroversion, but sadly, in the classical test that measures this 5-factor personality model, it's often regarded that way. That misses the unique elements of introversion as being its own sort of freestanding personality construct. Unfortunately, introverted people are sort of viewed as the opposite, like I said, of extroverts. And what it means then is we don't define this clearly. Introverted people tend to be more quiet. They spend more time in self-reflection and in their own heads. They can be very measured before they speak, and not only appreciate, but may sometimes even need solitude. A healthy and balanced take on introversion is that it is calm, solitude-seeking, person who has a lot of concentration, deliberation, reflective, a person who's thoughtful, contemplative, introspective. Researcher Jonathan Cheek talks about 4 types of introverts: the thinking, restrained, social, and anxious. And frankly, it's really only the anxious introverts that sort of map onto this idea of introverted people as more socially anxious and ruminative. The other types aren't like that. Now, introverts can get their sociability on and be really social when it matters, for anything that feels important to them. They are good planners. They're good at delaying gratification. Their social networks, they may be smaller, but introverts often have deeper and higher quality social networks. Some of you are saying, well, can't we be a little bit of both? I think all of us sort of lean a little bit more one way or another, but it is a continuum. In the middle, where introversion kind of meets extroversion, folks right there in the middle have been termed ambiverts, or folks who are able to get their social selves on from time to time and be good with it, and also do well both with solitude. So they can do well solitude and social settings. At the high levels of introversion, you may have someone who is just very isolated or very solitude seeking and really doesn't cultivate social relationships. But what does introversion in general mean for entering narcissistic relationships? I personally think introverts may actually have a little bit of protection. The sort of being in their heads, a little less interested in social settings, the less social grandstanding, that may not be as attractive to narcissistic people or relationships. However, the one type of narcissism where introversion could be at risk for being drawn in is with the vulnerable/covert narcissistic folks who can be quite introverted themselves. So it could be that there is that shared affinity which can create a vulnerability. In the relationship with a narcissist and an introverted person, the narcissistic person may not have patience for the introverted person who may be in their heads more and may even be more conflict averse and not give in to the baiting. However, the really problematic flip side is that an introverted person may not have a larger social network to help weather this storm, may be prone to rumination, and could possibly even self-blame on the premise that they were not being more social and open and in the relationship the way the narcissistic person wanted. An introverted person may have a slight risk and also endure being treated with contempt and mockery for being up in their heads a lot. Introverted people do tend to pause before speaking. Well, can you imagine that in this day and age? They actually stop and think before they open their mouths. And that approach actually inflames narcissistic people who are often just impulsive and interrupt. And that can just be a very toxic dynamic for introverted people to have to navigate. Now, when it comes to getting out of a relationship or even healing from one of these relationships, the introspective nature of an introverted person can be a blessing and a curse. A blessing because introverted people may be more willing to take the time to sort of think it out, but also have to balance the curse, the greater likelihood of rumination, which is a bane of all survivors of narcissistic abuse. Remember, healthy introverts may have smaller social networks, but like I said, the smaller group of people they have can be quite robust, which can be a real help as a person navigates the healing process. However, at the farther end of the introverted spectrum, a smaller network and greater social anxiety can result in less likelihood of having sounding boards, support, and the greater rumination and self-blame and self-doubt can also muddy the waters of healing for introverts. Now listen, I'm not going to not talk about my introversion. I'm a natural introvert who has gotten into narcissistic relationships. I actually personally think it was more of my agreeableness that got me into trouble, and that's going to be the next one we talk about in this series, than the introversion. In fact, to make the relationships work, to make these narcissistic relationships work, I did find myself trying to be more extroverted, which is very much against my nature, and it exhausted me. Honestly, if a person can just honor their introverted self in a world that doesn't appreciate it, it could be a great hedge against being in the exact kinds of environments that narcissistic people gravitate towards. However, you do need to be on watch for those often quite socially anxious, covert, vulnerable narcissistic folks, and for the communal do-gooders who can often trick us, any of us. And listen, I'm going to give a big hug to all of my fellow traveler introverts out there. It's a funny world because introverts have often been, introversion is often associated with sort of poorer mental health on certain outcomes just because it's a less valued quality. Extroverts really sort of run the show in the Western world. But I do think that in some ways introverts are just not as compelling to narcissistic people. So that's a great kind of a gateway thing. But once you're in, I think a narcissistic person really can do a number on an introvert by sort of making it about like, well, if you weren't in your head all the time, if we could just go out sometimes, obviously I went and talked to somebody else because you don't really talk to me, that kind of nonsense. I'm telling you, just stay home. Sometimes it's the best way to avoid the narcissist. You know what's so interesting? I made this introversion video and I said to my team, wait, I want to add one more point. So consider me adding one more point too. So it's why it looks a little bit thrown together. Here's my thought. Yeah, I love me my introverts, and I think I was so excited that I forgot to make this point, which is that let me tell you one superpower that introverts have when it comes to healing from narcissistic abuse. It is that capacity for solitude. One of the pieces of guidance I give to a lot of people when they're going through healing from narcissistic abuse is to spend some time alone. So much of us gets defined by the narcissistic relationship or the narcissistic system that we don't do that important work of figuring out who we are separate from that relationship. And the place to do that is solitude. Well, introverted people are sort of purpose-built for that. And that capacity to be alone for a while can actually give that place of rest and nurturance that allows us to sort of connect to ourselves and do this really hard work of figuring out who we are separate from this relationship. So I didn't want to forget to make that point because that solitude does serve you well. So introverts, one more takeaway for you. That ability to be alone may actually be one of the most useful abilities you have as you try to heal from a narcissistic relationship. Now, as much as I own up to my introversion, and I do, when it comes to personality styles, agreeableness is my forever favorite. Heaven love the agreeable folks. Agreeable people are cooperative, empathic, humble, and helpful. They tend to be selfless and play by the rules. They tend to avoid conflict and strive for collaborative solutions to problems. And that's sort of, again, that's when that healthy level, moderate to moderate, low, high levels of agreeableness, right? At the right level, that sweet spot of agreeableness. These are the good, respectful, compassionate, kind, cooperative folks among us. Now, if agreeableness gets too high, it can be tricky because there's a risk of being almost interpersonally naive, easily taken advantage of. These high agreeable people exhaust themselves trying to please other people and may not even get recognized in work or in life because they're just too humble. Now, at the low level of agreeableness, we could call this disagreeableness or antagonism. And guess whose personality lives there? Yep, the counterweight to agreeableness is antagonism. And antagonism is the defining trait of narcissism. So the absence of agreeableness, basically disagreeableness, is a person who does not work well with others, takes advantage of others, lacks empathy, is arrogant, oppositional, selfish, and entitled. But let's get back to agreeableness because that's what this video is about. Because agreeableness is a very important vulnerability to understand. It's unfortunate that something so good can actually be so bad for you when it comes to narcissistic relationships. Now, Sandra Brown's research suggests that antagonistic people who are narcissistic and psychopathic, that these are people who actually target agreeable people. And that research finding makes sense. The agreeable folks are an easy ride for the narcissistic and psychopathic folks. Agreeable folks are forgiving. They give lots of supply. They expect little reciprocity. They don't expect anything back. They're willing to give in. They're willing to capitulate. It's a narcissistic person's damn dream. And as a result, for a lot of agreeable folks, red flags may get missed, rationalizations, excuses, and justifications made, benefits of the doubt issued. They'll try to see the glass as half full, and you know the rest of that story. I would estimate that a large proportion of people who show up for therapy or help for narcissistic abuse are agreeable. These are folks who are so kind and compassionate and sweet and mean no harm and are caught up in something abusive and atrocious. And because of that sort of bedrock of that agreeable style, may even have trouble seeing and making sense of how bad this other person's behavior is. If you were when you were a child, your agreeableness, it was tough because a narcissistic parent can run roughshod over a child like this, and the child is eternally forgiving and full of excuses. These may be children who become helper, fixer, or peacekeeper children, just trying to make everything right, not complaining, making excuses, and even showing up quite cheerful. As you can imagine, agreeableness can also really keep a person not only drawn into a narcissistic relationship, but also keep them stuck in any kind of narcissistic relationship. The empathy, humility, belief in other people, and the selflessness can all mean that even above and beyond the trauma bond is an intrinsic willingness to make excuses and justify and see the other person's point of view, no matter how badly that other person's behaving. The informal designation that people use of the empath is sort of a layperson's word for a person high in this quality of agreeableness. And as a result, agreeable people can get stuck for lifetimes in toxic relationships. Because it is your personality, it's not that amenable to change. And remarkably, despite the toxic mess that a relationship like this can be, agreeable people may even just remain agreeable and just keep blaming themselves and making excuses. It's painful and it's heartbreaking because an agreeable person in a narcissistic relationship can spend a lifetime blaming themselves for everything that went wrong in the relationship and always trying to meet the narcissistic person 90% of the way. So, what about when a relationship ends? The agreeable person may be prone to hoovering, to being willing to make allowances for the behavior and give second chances, right? And to subsequently get burned again. It can also be difficult for agreeable folks who skew towards seeing the good in people because the repeated fails of these relationships can also sort of puncture the worldview of an agreeable person, which can result in its own form of existential sadness. The agreeable person may keep trying and trying, but through therapy may learn to set somewhat better boundaries and also learn about the dynamics of narcissism. I gotta say, it's really, really difficult for an agreeable person to engage from an existing relationship, especially if they perceive the other person as needing them. For example, a family relationship. I've certainly seen it happen, but it comes at tremendous psychological cost for agreeable people for whom cutting off someone who they feel needs them is very hard. The high agreeable people are the people who struggle the most and may also be the ones who are the most exploited, manipulated, and harmed by these relationships. I have to say that a large proportion of my practice with narcissistically abusive clients has been with agreeable clients. Good, sweet, flexible, empathic, kind people who intellectually get it, but who hurt in their hearts. And even after they address, we do the work on their primary narcissistic relationships, like parents or partners or spouses or longtime friendships or intense workplace relationships, they will find that they do repeat the cycle. Personality is a strong driver, and it's very hard for us to shift or change. Gotta say, my self-disclosure here is that next to introversion, my agreeableness is my next highest score. In fact, they're almost the same. And I gotta say, an agreeable introvert is a funny little person. My score would suggest that I'm empathic and kind and nice, but I don't like a crowd, and that definitely tracks. My agreeableness has also gotten me into trouble. And when you look at my personality, because you can top me off with a little bit of a neuroticism chaser, Well, that's all my self-doubt and self-devaluation, which when it's coupled with my empathy, that agreeableness, it was like blood on the water for the narcissistic shark. I got to tell you, I adore agreeable people. I seek them out. I favor them. I seek them out as friends. But the harder reality, at least for me, is that my agreeableness has gotten me into enough trouble that I actually kind of keep to myself more than I ever have. It happens to a lot of survivors. In a way, we feel like if I get myself out there again, it's almost harder to do this again, so I'm not. The world needs more agreeable people desperately. So to all my agreeable friends and viewers, big hug to you, and watch your back, your heart, and your soul. Openness is the funny one of these traits in this 5-factor model. It might be sort of the trickiest. From a scientific perspective, openness is often the one that sort of statistically feels the least stable. But all of that said, let's do a deeper dive into this quality called openness. Now, people in that sort of healthy range of openness, moderate, even to the moderate higher, slightly higher level of openness, they're open. This scale is actually formally called openness to experience. And these mid-range, healthy to slightly higher than expectable scores mean a person with a more active imagination, who care about art and other creative expression, who are open to new experiences and seeking out new experiences like travel, being open to a range of intellectual ideas, being tolerant of ambiguity, and having a willingness to push back on authority and the way things have always been done, as well as an openness to exploring one's own feelings or even the feelings of other people. Again, as an aside, if openness gets way too high, like super high, you might find someone who's kind of a little bit all over the map and constantly on a grail search for more and more new experiences. They might almost feel unrooted. You may find people who are far, far, far more experimental than the average bear in just about every area of life. Now, if openness is very, 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 very low, you find people who are rigidly traditional, rigidly conservative, have absolutely no interest in exploring new ideas or perspectives, can be very moralistic, potentially even judgmental, but definitely not open to new anything. May even feel like a bit of a throwback and perhaps even biased in a very backward and even discriminatory way. But in that healthy level of openness, okay? What does this mean for narcissistic relationships? Let's start with basics. People high in openness are open. So open people are open. And so they may be willing to explore a relationship with anyone who seems interesting. Now, that could set up a little bit of a risk here of getting pulled into a narcissistic relationship for a few reasons. A higher in openness person may be so open to different ways of being that they will also be a bit more tolerant of a narcissistic person's behavior and may be willing to entertain the narcissistic person's worldviews and perspectives, even if they are strange or problematic. People higher in openness are also curious, and because of that, may let the relationship keep unfolding even if red flags come up, because their exploration and curiosity about something or someone new is, again, so robust. Narcissistic people, especially more grandiose narcissists and even communal narcissists, may actually be very attracted to people who are higher in openness because people higher in openness are interesting. The only narcissistic people who may find people who are higher in openness or in healthy openness off-putting are more of the self-righteous narcissist, the narcissistic people who are very restrictive and moralistic and controlling and judgmental. That subset of narcissistic people will not like the high openness, or I shouldn't say high, healthy openness people out there. Now, while you're in a narcissistic relationship, again, openness, that trait, may mean that a person is more willing and able to tolerate the bizarre range of beliefs that a narcissistic person may have. Now, this may mean that an open person who's very tolerant may have actually more tolerance for the BS that arises in a narcissistic relationship. Now, there's some interesting quirks in open people, not all, but some. For example, a person higher or moderate to high openness may be willing to hear whatever perspective the narcissistic person has. For example, even if the narcissistic person cheated on them, they might be willing to hear, like, what was that about? And as a result, may end up enduring a lot more of the bad behavior in a narcissistic relationship for a longer time. Listen, an open person may be open to quirks and trying new things, and open people may, not always, but sometimes may actually also be more sexually open, more open to trying new things in a relationship. And so again, especially in the early phases, may do well with a narcissistic person who is, especially, it might be very novelty seeking or very sexually experimental. But an open person is never going to be open to invalidation. There is no openness trait to different perspectives that makes invalidation better, right? But what about on the back end? Again, a person higher in openness may be more open to the narcissistic person's process and journey. This is not to say that a person higher or moderate high in openness is a capitulator or a codependent. Quite the opposite. If a narcissistic relationship ends, people who have healthy levels of openness will still be hurt, but the openness could foster a resilience. And remember, nobody, not even a person who has good, healthy, robust levels of openness, is open to invalidation. Nobody is. Nobody likes that. Now, people who are lower, like significantly lower in this trait called openness, the ones who are closed off to new ideas and perspectives, who are not curious, who are not tolerant of a new anything, who actually kind of love authority and tradition, by and large, believe it or not, overall, this probably won't work well with a narcissistic person, again, unless it's one of those rigid, self-righteous, moralistic, judgmental narcissistic people. Otherwise, that rigidity might be a little off-putting for many narcissistic people because they may feel judged early in the game. But to sort of narcissists who meet, rigid narcissists who meet something like that, it could work. Now, openness is such an interesting quality, and by itself, it doesn't always tell us much, but as it mixes with the other personality patterns, it makes a little more sense. Higher openness and higher agreeableness that we've talked about, that's just a really flexible, curious person who gets along really well with folks. I like that mix a lot. Now, if higher openness happens to co-occur with slightly higher neuroticism, that's not that likely, but it can happen. There may be then someone who is sort of open to a range of perspectives, but still really may struggle with those negative mood states, and despite their openness, may still struggle more when a narcissistic relationship is happening or ends. Now, people who are open, tolerant of ambiguity, flexible, curious, just open to everything, are those who are higher, again, and those are in that moderate to high level of openness. Again, my personal bias, it's a personal bias, I think it's a nice style. There's a real mental flexibility and an attitudinal flexibility here. These are typically people who are typically more liberal, more open to hearing new and different voices, having relationships with people who are different than them, who look different, who have different backstories. And unless it gets to be so open that it gets weird, and that can happen, that might feel like a very extreme alternative lifestyle thing. And if both people are down with that, it's consensual, then good for them. They found each other. That mid-level of openness is good. I think it's healthy for a personality. And while I do think overall this personality style could be a little tricky when it enters into a relationship with narcissistic personalities, because it could get a person sucked in. And if you are higher in healthy in openness, you might actually be open to their nonsense. Honestly, outside of narcissistic relationships, the open personality style can really set someone up for a far more interesting and adventurous life. As the world evolves, I mean, what the funny thing is human history has been so same until the Industrial Revolutions, and then with the more technological revolution, I'd say over the last 50 or 60 years, the high openness people are really thriving because the way we communicate and all the shifts in the world and even how human relationships happen has become so fluid that the people who do have more of that openness and flexibility, There's something that works there. Again, they're just more curious. They're like, oh, I'm never going to talk into a little glass screen in my pocket. Are people like, well, that's cool. Let me take a look at that. It's the that's cool people. And like I said, you see very tolerant of difference, very tolerant of ambiguity, love beauty and art, and will take a minute and say, oh my gosh, isn't the universe a beautiful thing? And we'll look at the stars. There's a really, I would say, magical quality about people who have those really healthy, moderate, high levels of openness. And again, the problem is, I think that's also very intriguing to a fair chunk of narcissistic people. But you healthy levels of openness people, there's a little bit of a resilience in you. You might be able to be circumspect. If you have a little bit of neuroticism in there, it might make these relationships tougher. But folks out there with the solid levels of openness and those higher levels of agreeableness, whew, come find me if you ever see me at a coffee shop. I'd love to talk to you. So let's talk first about what conscientiousness is. Again, it's a personality style that encompasses things like diligence, discipline, attention to detail, ambition, achievement orientation, being deliberate, and thinking before you act as opposed to being spontaneous. These are folks who are responsible, get things done, make the deadline. People who are conscientious are thorough, organized, and self-motivated. At a moderate, healthy level of conscientiousness, these are folks who make great students, great employees. They get things done, and they get them done on time, and you can count on them to get things done. Even if they have to overextend themselves to get it done, they'll get it done. Now, to that point, if conscientiousness gets too high, we can see an almost obsessive work ethic to the detriment of other things in life, like family and social relationships, as well as an over-focus on order and detail to a level that can also feel compulsive. If conscientiousness is very low, we may see impulsivity, disinhibition, and even sensation seeking to a problematic degree to where a person could get hurt or in trouble. Now, people low in conscientiousness often struggle as students. They struggle in detail-oriented jobs. It doesn't work many times. So could conscientiousness put you at risk for a narcissistic relationship? Now, certainly not probably in the way that agreeableness does or even how neuroticism does. If anything, conscientious people, I could see how they would initially be attractive to narcissistic folks because it is a personality trait that is associated with success, which makes sense, right? So the success element and the status element that come with it, I could see how that might draw in a narcissistic person. In a narcissistic relationship, a conscientious person may be really good at keeping the trains running on time, getting things done efficiently, and all of that may make the narcissistic person's life easier. Conscientious people almost make it look easy. They get everything done. But given that narcissism is often associated with impulsivity, you can see how narcissism and conscientiousness might even be sort of two very different styles. People much, much higher in conscientiousness may have an ability to compartmentalize a bit, put their heads down and get things done. And that potentially could give them greater endurance in a narcissistic relationship, merely because they're probably a little more distracted and the organization and the work almost serves as a defense against the chaos of these relationships. However, conscientious people who are often doers may also get frustrated because of all the logistical stuff and keeping things organized and getting things done. It may still not be enough for a narcissistic family member, a partner, or boss. So even that could result in some confusion or even some distress for a person who is very, very conscientious. Basically, no matter how good you are at keeping it organized, it's not enough. In general, obviously the more impulsive narcissistic people are typically going to be lower in conscientiousness. So they may actually originally do well with a low conscientiousness thrill seeker. But then if that happens, if those two people get together, I'm not sure who's going to be paying the bills. So those two low conscientiousness people coming together could be relationships that burn really bright and exciting and then quickly fritter out because there's no grown-up in the relationship. Now, on the back end, I don't know that a conscientious person would have any more difficulty with healing after one of these relationships ends than any other personality style. May even have a slightly smoother path. It may actually relate to the other personality styles that are co-occurring with the conscientiousness. For example, if there was also slightly higher neuroticism in someone, that would actually be what complicated the healing, but perhaps, the conscientiousness not so much. The end of a relationship does bring disorder and chaos into a situation. So that may be what could be uncomfortable for a conscientious person who may then need to bring order to divorce proceedings and paperwork and finding a new job, things like that. Now, one little wrinkle in this is that there is one subset of narcissistic people who very likely have quite relatively high conscientiousness. And those are the self-righteous narcissists. The ones who tend to be workaholics, detail-obsessed, morally rigid, judgmental, all of that. But they also tend to be quite conscientious, like I said, workaholics. So they may actually initially vibe with a conscientious person. But conscientiousness by itself, people like that, they're not necessarily judgmental or morally rigid or dismissive. That's the narcissism part talking about, which draws that out. So a merely conscientious person who may be attractive to a narcissistic person may actually end up hurt by the coldness and dismissiveness. I have seen these pairings play out. The financially obsessive and disciplined and callous narcissistic person is attracted to and ends up in a relationship with a person who is just sort of normally conscientious and has a solid work ethic and shared goals of achievement and organization and order and discipline, but is then confused by how controlling and cruelly controlling that narcissistic person is about the finances, and may blame themselves for being questioning when they should be happy that someone else is managing the money. Note to the wise out there, don't let anyone ever sort of know where all the money is without you knowing it too. Now, conscientiousness is a good thing at that healthy level. I don't know that it's a risk factor for narcissistic relationships. If anything, it may provide some defense. However, it could make someone attractive to a narcissistic person or leave a person who is conscientious trying to put their head down and conscientiously trying to work the relationship out through diligence. And that's not going to work. Discipline may work when it comes to a work deadline or getting a project done. It's never going to work in a narcissistic relationship. My conscientious students were my favorites when I was a professor because they would get stuff done on time and come to class prepared. You just need to have that conscientiousness at that healthy level so it doesn't become obsessive. And remember that low conscientiousness is actually something we see in lots of narcissistic folks who may not get things done and lack discipline, but then lean on entitlement to portray why they couldn't get it done. Oh, why should I have to do this, right? So again, for people who are not, for the folks not the narcissistic person, the you, conscientiousness, unlike some of the other stuff like agreeableness and neuroticism, which give us some real insights on the narcissistic relationship, it may just be a part of you, and if anything, it might get someone stuck in that thought loop of like, okay, I need to be able to make this work. I am so organized. I can figure anything out. Why can't I figure this one out? There ain't no amount of conscientiousness that's ever going to let that happen. Thanks again.